Chapter 19, The Growing Pains of Urbanization, 1870 to 1900. Chapter outline, 19.1, Urbanization and Its Challenges. 19.2, The African American Great Migration and the New European Immigration. 19.3, Relief from the Chaos of Urban Life. 19.4, Change reflected in thought and writing. We saw the big woman with spikes on her head. So begins Sadie Frown's first memory of arriving in the United States. Many Americans experienced in their new home what the 13-year-old Polish girl had seen in the silhouette of the Statue of Liberty. Figure 19.1. For the millions of immigrants arriving by ship in New York City's harbor, the sight of the Statue of Liberty, as in Unveiling the Statue of Liberty, 1886, by Edward Moran, stood as a physical representation of the new freedoms and economic opportunities they hoped to find. A wondrous world of new opportunities fraught with dangers. Sadie and her mother, for instance, had left Poland after her father's death. Her mother died shortly thereafter, and Sadie had to find her own way in New York, working in factories and slowly assimilating to life in a vast multinational metropolis. Her story is similar to millions of others as people came to the United States seeking a better future than the one they had at home. The future they found, however, was often grim. While many believed in the land of opportunity, the reality of urban life in the United States was more chaotic and difficult than people expected. In addition to the challenges of language, class, race, and ethnicity, these new arrivals dealt with low wages, overcrowded buildings, poor sanitation, and widespread disease. The land of opportunity, it seemed, did not always deliver on its promises. (19.1) Urbanization and Its Challenges. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the growth of American cities in the late 19th century, identify the key challenges that Americans faced due to urbanization, as well as some of the possible solutions to those challenges. Figure 19.2. Professional baseball begins with the founding of the National League, 1876. Chicago builds first 10-story skyscraper, 1885. Frank Sprague invents electric trolley, 1887. Jane Addams opens Hull House in Chicago, 1889. Jacob Reese publishes How the Other Half Lives. Carnegie Hall opens in New York, 1890. City Beautiful movement begins, 1893. Coney Island Amusement Park opens, 1895. Urbanization occurred rapidly in the second half of the 19th century in the United States for a number of reasons. The new technologies of the time led to a massive leap in industrialization, requiring large numbers of workers. New electric lights and powerful machinery allowed factories to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers were forced into grueling 12-hour shifts, requiring them to live close to the factories. While the work was dangerous and difficult, many Americans were willing to leave behind the declining prospects of pre-industrial agriculture in the hope of better wages in industrial labor. Furthermore, problems ranging from famine to religious persecution led a new wave of immigrants to arrive from Central, Eastern, and Southern Europe, many of whom settled and found work near the cities where they first arrived. Immigrants sought solace and comfort among others who shared the same language and customs, and the nation's cities became an invaluable economic and cultural resource. Although cities such as Philadelphia, Boston, and New York sprang up from the initial days of colonial settlement, the explosion in urban population growth did not occur until the mid-19th century, figure 19.3. As these panels illustrate, the population of the United States grew rapidly in the late 1800s. Much of this new growth took place in urban areas defined by the census as 2,500 people or more. And this urban population, particularly that of major cities, B, dealt with challenges and opportunities that were unknown in previous generations. At this time, the attractions of city life, and in particular employment opportunities, grew exponentially due to rapid changes in industrialization. Before the mid-1800s, factories, such as the early textile mills, had to be located near rivers and seaports, both for the transport of goods and the necessary water power. Production became dependent upon seasonal water flow, with cold, icy winters all but stopping river transportation entirely. The development of the steam engine transformed this need, allowing businesses to locate their factories near urban centers. These factories encouraged more and more people to move to urban areas where jobs were plentiful, but hourly wages were often low, and the work was routine and grindingly monotonous. Eventually, cities developed their own unique characters based on the core industry that spurred their growth. In Pittsburgh, it was steel. In Chicago, it was meat packing. In New York, the garment and financial industries dominated, and Detroit by the mid-20th century was defined by the automobiles it built. But all cities, at this time, regardless of their industry, suffered from the universal problems that rapid expansion brought with it, including concerns over housing and living conditions, transportation, and communication. These issues were almost always rooted in deep class inequalities, shaped by racial divisions, religious differences, and ethnic strife, and distorted by corrupt local politics. Click and explore. This 1884 Bureau of Labor Statistics report for Massachusetts from Boston looks in detail at the wages, living conditions, and moral code of the girls who worked in the clothing factories there. The keys to successful urbanization. As the country grew, certain elements led some towns to morph into large urban centers while others did not. The following four innovations proved critical in shaping urbanization at the turn of the century: electric lighting, communication improvements, intra-city transportation, and the rise of skyscrapers. As people migrated for the new jobs, they often struggled with the absence of basic urban infrastructures, such as better transportation, adequate housing, means of communication, and efficient sources of light and energy. Even the basic necessities, such as fresh water and proper sanitation, often taken for granted in the countryside, presented a greater challenge in urban life. Electric lighting. Thomas Edison patented the incandescent light bulb in 1879. This development quickly became common in homes as well as factories, transforming how even lower and middle-class Americans lived. Although slow to arrive in rural areas of the country, electric power became readily available in cities when the first commercial power plants began to open in 1882. When Nikola Tesla subsequently developed the AC, alternating current, system for the Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company, power supplies for lights and other factory equipment could extend for miles from the power source. AC power transformed the use of electricity, allowing urban centers to physically cover greater areas. In the factories, electric lights permitted operations to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This increase in production required additional workers, and this demand brought more people to cities. Gradually, cities began to illuminate the streets with electric lamps to allow the city to remain alight throughout the night. No longer did the pace of life and economic activity slow substantially at sunset, the way it had in smaller towns. The cities, following the factories that drew people there, stayed open all the time. Communications improvements. The telephone, patented in 1876, greatly transformed communication both regionally and nationally. The telephone rapidly supplanted the telegraph as the preferred form of communication. By 1900, over 1.5 million telephones were in use around the nation, whether as private lines in the homes of some middle and upper class Americans, or as jointly used party lines in many rural areas. By allowing instant communication over larger distances at any given time, growing telephone networks made urban sprawl possible. In the same way that electric lights spurred greater factory production and economic growth, the telephone increased business through the more rapid pace of demand. Now, orders could come constantly via telephone rather than via mail order. More orders generated greater production, which in turn required still more workers. This demand for additional labor played a key role in urban growth, as expanding companies sought workers to handle the increasing consumer demand for their products. Intra-city transportation. As cities grew and sprawled outward, a major challenge was efficient travel within the city, from homes to factories or shops, and then back again. Most transportation infrastructure was used to connect cities to each other, typically by rail or canal. Prior to the 1880s, two of the most common forms of transportation within cities were the omnibus and the horse car. An omnibus was a large horse-drawn carriage. A horse car was similar to an omnibus, but it was placed on iron or steel tracks to provide a smoother ride. While these horse-driven vehicles worked adequately in smaller, less congested cities, they were not equipped to handle the larger crowds that developed at the close of the century. The horses had to stop and rest, and horse manure became an ongoing problem. In 1887, Frank Sprague invented the electric trolley, which worked along the same concept as the horse car, with a large wagon on tracks, but was powered by electricity rather than horses. The electric trolley could run throughout the day and night, like the factories and the workers who fueled them. But it also modernized less important industrial centers, such as the southern city of Richmond, Virginia. As early as 1873, San Francisco engineers adopted pulley technology from the mining industry to introduce cable cars and turn the city's steep hills into elegant middle-class communities. However, as crowds continued to grow in the largest cities, such as Chicago and New York, trolleys were unable to move efficiently through the crowds of pedestrians. Figure 19.4. Although trolleys were far more efficient than horse-drawn carriages, populous cities such as New York experienced frequent accidents, as depicted in this 1895 illustration from Leslie's Weekly. A. To avoid overcrowded streets, trolleys soon went underground, as at the Public Gardens Portal in Boston, B, where 3 different lines met to enter the Tremont Street subway, the oldest subway tunnel in the United States, opening on September 1st, 1897. To avoid this challenge, city planners elevated the trolley lines above the streets, creating elevated trains, or L trains, as early as 1868 in New York City, and quickly spreading to Boston in 1887 and Chicago in 1892. Finally, as skyscrapers began to dominate the air, transportation evolved one step further to move underground as subways. Boston's subway system began operating in 1897 and was quickly followed by New York and other cities. The rise of skyscrapers. The last limitation that large cities had to overcome was the ever-increasing need for space. Eastern cities, unlike their Midwestern counterparts, could not continue to grow outward, as the land surrounding them was already settled. Geographic limitations, such as rivers or the coast, also hampered sprawl. And in all cities, citizens needed to be close enough to urban centers to conveniently access work, shops, and other core institutions of urban life. The increasing cost of real estate made upward growth attractive, and so did the prestige that towering buildings carried for the businesses that occupied them. Workers completed the first skyscraper in Chicago, the 10-story Home Insurance Building, in 1885. Figure 19.5. While the technology existed to engineer tall buildings, it was not until the invention of the electric elevator in 1889 that skyscrapers began to take over the urban landscape. Shown here is the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, considered the first modern skyscraper. Although engineers had the capability to go higher thanks to new steel construction techniques, they required another vital invention in order to make taller buildings viable: the elevator. In 1889, the Otis Elevator Company, led by inventor Elisha Otis, installed the first electric elevator. This began the skyscraper craze, allowing developers in eastern cities to build and market prestigious real estate in the hearts of crowded eastern metropoles. Defining American. Jacob Reese and the window into How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Reese was a Danish immigrant who moved to New York in the late 19th century and, after experiencing poverty and joblessness firsthand, ultimately built a career as a police reporter. In the course of his work, he spent much of his time in the slums and tenements of New York's working poor. Appalled by what he found there, Reese began documenting these scenes of squalor and sharing them through lectures and ultimately through the publication of his book, How the Other Half Lives, in 1890. Figure 19.6. The photographs, such as Bandit's Roost, 1888, taken on Mulberry Street in the infamous Five Points neighborhood of Manhattan's Lower East Side, Jacob Reese documented the plight of New York City slums in the late 19th century. By most contemporary accounts, Reese was an effective storyteller, using drama and racial stereotypes to tell his stories of the ethnic slums he encountered. But while his racial thinking was very much a product of his time, he was also a reformer. He felt strongly that upper and middle-class Americans could and should care about the living conditions of the poor. In his book and lectures, he argued against the immoral landlords and useless laws that allowed dangerous living conditions and high rents. He also suggested remodeling existing tenements or building new ones. He was not alone in his concern for the plight of the poor. Other reporters and activists had already brought the issue into the public's eye, and Reese's photographs added a new element to the story. To tell his stories, Reese used a series of deeply compelling photographs. Reese and his group of amateur photographers moved through the various slums of New York, laboriously setting up their tripods and explosive chemicals to create enough light to take the photographs. His photos and writings shocked the public, made Reese a well-known figure both in his day and beyond, and eventually led to new state legislation curbing abuses in tenements. The immediate challenges of urban life. Congestion, pollution, crime, and disease were prevalent problems in all urban centers. City planners and inhabitants alike sought new solutions to the problems caused by rapid urban growth. Living conditions for most working-class urban dwellers were atrocious. They lived in crowded tenement houses and cramped apartments with terrible ventilation and substandard plumbing and sanitation. As a result, disease ran rampant, with typhoid and cholera common. Memphis, Tennessee experienced waves of cholera, 1873, followed by yellow fever, 1878 and 1879, that resulted in the loss of over 10,000 lives. By the late 1880s, New York City, Baltimore, Chicago, and New Orleans had all introduced sewage pumping systems to provide efficient waste management. Many cities were also serious fire hazards. An average working-class family of 6, with 2 adults and 4 children, had, at best, a 2-bedroom tenement. By one 1900 estimate, in the New York City borough of Manhattan alone, there were nearly 50,000 tenement houses. The photographs of these tenement houses are seen in Jacob Reese's book, How the Other Half Lives, discussed in the feature above. Citing a study by the New York State Assembly at this time, Reese found New York to be the most densely populated city in the world, with as many as 800 residents per square acre in the Lower East Side working-class slums, comprising the 11th and 13th wards. Click and explore. Visit New York City tenement life to get an impression of the everyday life of tenement dwellers on Manhattan's Lower East Side. Churches and civic organizations provided some relief to the challenges of working-class city life. Churches were moved to intervene through their belief in the concept of the social gospel. This philosophy stated that all Christians, whether they were church leaders or social reformers, should be as concerned about the conditions of life in the secular world as the afterlife, and the Reverend Washington Gladden was a major advocate. Rather than preaching sermons on heaven and hell, Gladden talked about social changes of the time, urging other preachers to follow his lead. He advocated for improvements in daily life and encouraged Americans of all classes to work together for the betterment of society. His sermons included the message to love thy neighbor, and held that all Americans had to work together to help the masses. As a result of his influences, churches began to include gymnasiums and libraries, as well as offer evening classes on hygiene and health care. Other religious organizations, like the Salvation Army and the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, expanded their reach in American cities at this time as well. Beginning in the 1870s, these organizations began providing community services and other benefits to the urban poor. In the secular sphere, the settlement house movement of the 1890s provided additional relief. Pioneering women such as Jane Addams in Chicago and Lillian Wald in New York led this early progressive reform movement in the United States, building upon ideas originally fashioned by social reformers in England. With no particular religious bent, they worked to create settlement houses in urban centers where they could help the working class, and in particular, working class women, find aid. Their help included child daycare, evening classes, libraries, gym facilities, and free health care. Adams opened her now famous Hull House, figure 19.7, in Chicago in 1889, and Wald's Henry Street Settlement opened in New York 6 years later. Figure 19.7. Jane Addams opened Hull House in Chicago in 1889, offering services and support to the city's working poor. The movement spread quickly to other cities, where they not only provided relief to working class women, but also offered employment opportunities for women graduating college in the growing field of social work. Oftentimes, living in the settlement houses among the women they helped, these college graduates experienced the equivalent of living social classrooms in which to practice their skills, which also frequently caused friction with immigrant women who had their own ideas of reform and self-improvement. The success of the settlement house movement later became the basis of a political agenda that included pressure for housing laws, child labor laws, and workers' compensation laws, among others. Florence Kelley, who originally worked with Adams in Chicago, later joined Wald's efforts in New York. Together, they created the National Child Labor Committee and advocated for the subsequent creation of the Children's Bureau in the U.S. Department of Labor in 1912. Julia Lathrop, herself a former resident of Hull House, became the first woman to head a federal government agency when President William Howard Taft appointed her to run the Bureau. Settlement house workers also became influential leaders in the women's suffrage movement, as well as the anti-war movement during World War I. My story. Jane Addams reflects on the settlement house movement. Jane Addams was a social activist whose work took many forms. She is perhaps best known as the founder of Hull House in Chicago, which later became a model for settlement houses throughout the country. Here, she reflects on the role that the settlement played. Life in the settlement discovers, above all, what has been called the extraordinary pliability of human nature. And it seems impossible to set any bounds to the moral capabilities which might unfold under ideal civic and educational conditions. But in order to obtain these conditions, the settlement recognizes the need of cooperation, both with the radical and the conservative. And from the very nature of the case, the settlement cannot limit its friends to any one political party or economic school. The settlement casts aside none of those which cultivated men have come to consider reasonable and goodly, but it insists that those belong as well to that great body of people who, because of toilsome and underpaid labor, are unable to procure them for themselves. Added to this is a profound conviction that the common stock of intellectual enjoyment should not be difficult of access because of the economic position of him who would approach it. That those best results of civilization upon which depend the finer and freer aspects of living must be incorporated into our common life and have free mobility through all elements of society if we would have our democracy endure. The educational activities of a settlement, as well as its philanthropic, civic, and social undertakings, are but differing manifestations of the attempt to socialize democracy, as is the very existence of the settlement itself. In addition to her pioneering work in the settlement house movement, Adams also was active in the women's suffrage movement, as well as an outspoken proponent for international peace efforts. She was instrumental in the relief effort after World War I, a commitment that led her winning the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931.